EU as an international actor, the assessment of its foreign policy record. Hopefully what you'll take out of this presentation is why the EU has struggled with foreign policy, the intricacies of the EU's foreign policy main body that directs it, and how the EU's foreign policy compares to NATO. Okay, this is a picture from the 1990 bombings in the Bosnia area. This was carried out by NATO. Basically, in this presentation, what I'm pointing out is NATO's foreign policy has been far in advance of the EU's, and the reason behind this is because the EU in this conflict was also involved, but they went about by diplomatic means, which failed, and then they had no contingency plan. Whereas NATO did the same thing, and they went and they did action, which is bombing on Serbian targets. The EU has consistently failed in this area, and they have way too many member states and too much bickering where they can't decide on one course of action. And this is an example behind this. Member states don't really get along all the time. So poor foreign policy. Why does the EU have poor foreign policy? This goes in hand with member state identity. Member states, citizens and diplomats still identify with their member state instead of the EU. And NATO is involved with EU states, and EU states don't want to be investing their resources into EU the same way it has with NATO. So EU is limited in that it can't go further than NATO has, because member states want to invest the resources in NATO, not the EU. Also, NATO has a foreign policy document called the Strategic Concept. EU has nothing like this. The Strategic Concept for NATO outlines all of its missions and its goals in foreign policy, but the EU has nothing anywhere close to it. It does have a document that I'll later explain to you that was passed in the Maastricht Treaty, but it's very broad and limited in scope. So where can the EU go, though? The EU has to be autonomous, consistent, coherent, comprehensive, and multilateral to gain good foreign policy. What I mean by this is the EU can't be NATO. It has to find something different, the way that it can affect the world some way different than NATO. It has to bring about that vision statement that NATO has and how it can accomplish its goals. And consistent. The EU has to be involved in affairs that deal with its vision statement and affect its people so the citizens can identify with it. It has to be coherent. All the institutions of the EU have to be in step with that vision statement that the EU brings across, and it has to move itself towards that. Also, it has to involve in the foreign policy many different sectors so that everything in the EU is oriented towards that foreign policy goals. And multilateral, it has to engage not only its member states, but also people of the world to bring about change. This is the main body that I was telling you about, the Common Security and Defense Policy. This was brought about because of security management, but it also deals hand in hand with foreign policy. It's currently headed by Catherine Ashton, and as I said before, many members of this policy are also members of NATO, which limits its scope. And it's too broad and limited. And this is Catherine Ashton. She's in charge of it, but she has many weaknesses that is holding it back. And part of these weaknesses, this is her title, I'll let you read it, but part of her weaknesses are that she can't speak more than one language fluently. This holds back foreign policy. She's never held a military post before, so she doesn't know how to respond to conflict. And she doesn't want an EU military headquarters, which many diplomats do. And she has poor humanitarian skills to bring about foreign policy, and that she never showed up for the earthquake in Haiti until it was too late. And many people disagree with her on that issue. So that concludes my presentation.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, yeah. So do we have any questions about regional policy, foreign policy? Yeah.
Well, you mentioned Ireland as like the shining success story.
Yeah.
Is there a shining failure story, like absolute failure of regional policy where they've tried really hard?
Some of the new former Soviet bloc countries, Romania, Bulgaria, they've only been in the Union for a few years though,
Sure.
so I think even some of the other cases that joined in 2004, the Baltic states come to mind, probably need a little bit more time to wait and see. Spain's been since 1986 a member, so I think it's easier to kind of comment on what it's been doing there
Okay.
the last 25 years.
Thank you.
I'll ask a question about the
Okay.
foreign policy. You pointed out the difficulties of coordinating among different countries a single foreign policy. Do you think it's possible? I mean, one can criticize how it's done, but then do you think it could be possible?
I think it could be, and that was my slide that I showed where what
Okay.
it needs to be to implement foreign policy. And it just has to bring about like a centralized focus of what it wants to do, because it has yet to do that. And once it brings all of its assets committed to that goal, then it will be able to do something. But as of yet, it hasn't been able to do that. But the Lisbon Treaty has been moving in that direction. It helped a lot.
Do you think that the biggest issue that they face is like not only like national issues but more like party issues? That's why they can't, come to a conclusion.
I think that definitely has something to do with it. I mean, that definitely would provide conflict for that area. And of course, when you get into ideological goals like going to war or not going to war, then you have issues in party conflicts. So yeah, I definitely think it has something to do with it.
All right. Well, thank you both. All right. So let's.
I didn't give any evaluation